Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. So we've worked with SAP UI5 quite a bit over the last couple of videos, and we've really focused on OData V2 consumption. That's been the primary use case in most customer scenarios up to this point. But of course, we're beginning this transition to OData V4. Newer version of the standard, more capabilities, and of course, we've already seen how with OData V4, we have a lot of new functionality that comes with core data and services. In particular, if we look at building Fiori applications and utilizing the Fiori annotations, they heavily leverage the additional functionality of OData V4 services. But kind of the irony there, you want to build the latest SAP UI5 applications that contain Fiori functionality. They need OData V4 annotations, but yet many of the Fiori templates and controls, like the Smart Table, don't yet support OData V4 model binding. Now, this is something that I know that over the next few months that SAP UI5 will clear up. There's new versions of SAP UI5 coming that do have more robust OData V4 support, and particularly some of the Fiori UI elements have now been adjusted, and the templates have been adjusted or are in the process of being adjusted to support OData V4. But we do find ourselves in a little bit of a situation. If you want to develop today, you want to take advantage of the great new functionality of core data and services and OData V4 services with Fiori annotations. Maybe you have to give up some of the UI element functionality that we've seen already, like the Smart Table that we've been utilizing in some of the earlier examples. Doesn't yet support binding to the OData V4 model. The other thing that we're going to see in this and the next video is that just the approach that SAP took with the OData V4 model is quite a bit different. So your coding, it isn't going to be as simple as just going into your manifest JSON and changing OData V2 to OData V4. The actual interface of the model is different. You know, we're making a pretty major change here. There's changes to the underlying OData concepts that we needed to account for. Plus, there were some fundamental changes to improve the experience that we wanted to make, but we didn't want to break the existing OData V2 model, so we waited until this transition to OData V4 to make some of those conceptual and fundamental changes. So let's go back into the Web IDE and let's build a new application, close all these windows, and remember back in our purchase order that we of course have the ability to define entities, but we can also begin to define some parts of our UI elements, our user interface, through additional annotations and do it in a layered approach so that some of it we maybe build into the database level, the lowest level entities like the column descriptions, for instance. Maybe other annotations we want to build at the service layer, or maybe we want UI specific, like an overlay of annotations. So even in a single service, we could have multiple annotation layers on top of that. And that's what we're going to see here. So we're going to start at the lowest level with purchase order, with our purchase order CDS and our current entities. What we want to do is we want to extend this now and add some annotations to this. So we've got that prepared over here in a little snippet. So let me go grab that. Let's actually replace the entire thing, because it would be too much cutting and pasting in different parts and just too error prone to insert just certain items here. But what you see what we're going to do is basically all over the place we're going to insert titles. So to our reusable data types, to our reusable structure, to the entity itself, we're adding a title. But we're also adding some other things in here, some other metadata. For instance, on the gross amount, we're going to set some measures to tell it that it is a currency. This will help in the display in the user interface. It's going to tell SAP UI5. It's going to be able to read these annotations and know that that's a currency column and automatically format it accordingly. Same thing here on some of these fields. We know the lifecycle status, the approval status, the confirmation status. These are things that are calculated on the server side based upon the actual data lifecycle. So we never want them to be changeable on the client side. So we can go ahead and set field controls to say that this should always be a read-only field. You know, these are immutable. So we're setting rules that aren't going to be, you know, this UI is going to allow change and this UI is going to allow read-only. No, we know that these certain columns are always read-only, no matter what user interface they're going to be or what services they're utilized in. So we're putting these rules at the lowest level with these annotations. We can also see other more powerful annotations. For instance, on the items, we actually said for text display, we want to use the item's product. So instead of showing you the item ID, which is just a number and probably pretty meaningless to the end user in the user interface, we're going to display the product ID as the unique ID. So we're setting up additional annotations that can be read by, in this case, the Fiori templates will read these kind of annotations and automatically replace some fields with others in the header and things like that. We also see search fields. So for instance, we're going to say that on the item, the product is a mandatory field. You always have to pass it in, and that it's going to be the default search element. So if you're going to search for PO items, if you're going to have value help, the automatic search will default to the product ID, because it doesn't make sense to search for the unique ID. It's just a number sequence. It makes much more sense to search for items by product. We can also do things like the currency code here. We're actually going to set up a value help here to say go to a completely other entity to get the allowed values for the currencies. So we're starting to set up drop-down list boxes and value helps in the user interface simply by defining the relationships within the annotations here as well. So you see, we're actually doing a lot of building of the user interface even here at the lowest data model level. Okay. So that's a powerful concept, and makes for a lot of reusability and a lot of consistency. And honestly, you know, how we've made this rapid move to Fiori user interfaces, if we had to hand code every user interface in this new world, it would have taken us much longer and there'd be much more maintenance. It's much better to define the bulk of the user interface in metadata on the back end, and then, as I said, multiple user interfaces could use these same entities, the same services, and they're going to consistently display the data the same way. It also makes it easier for you as a customer to extend this. As we'll see, we can layer these annotations on top of existing services, so you could add your own custom things that impact the user interface without changing any JavaScript code, any XML code. It's a very nice extensible way of working. So we want to do the same thing. We want to add annotations to our import CDS as well. So I've got a snippet for this. Import CDS.text. Once again, to keep from making a bunch of errors, cutting and pasting, we'll replace the whole thing, but really we're just adding some annotations here. It's the same sort of annotations you saw before. We're going to set unit of measures, currencies. We're going to set some value help annotations here. Currency code is going to go to the currency entity. And we see I actually defined the currency entity here, but mostly column headers. And language independent ones as well. We're going to go to the I18N, so we're going to go to our text bundles to supply all these columns, so it's also all translatable as well. All right. So now we want to do some less general annotations. We want some that are going to be applied to just the service, and maybe these entities are used in different places. So what we want to do is we want to go to the SRV module, and we already have our service definition here in our My Service CDS. Let's add another CDS file here, And we'll call this one Fiori Annotations My service.cds. We're basically saying these are the additional Fiori annotations that we want to layer on top of the existing My Service CDS file. And to do this, I've got a code snippet we'll bring in and then look at. So we'll call this Fiori1.text. So what you can see here, this is utilizing the extension approach that I described. We could, of course, come to My Service CDS and we could directly add annotations to these existing entities, these service entities. But you see what we're able to do here is we're able to say just using catalog service. So it's like going to import everything from the My Service.cds, and we can just like overlay annotations on top of an existing entity. So what we're going to say is annotate PO items view. So it's going to come here and grab the PO items view, which in turn is just a projection on top of items view, which items view came from our data model. So all the columns themselves are not going to be redefined. We don't have to repeat them here. We can just add in this annotation, and what we're going to add is some of the UI specific annotations. So for instance, we're going to define the line items. So you remember earlier in some of the videos when we were doing OData V2, to define the columns that we wanted displayed in our table header, we did that. We saw dynamic logic reading the metadata. This is going to be similar, except now we're going to put more metadata in here. We're actually going to set some annotations to say whether we want high, medium, or low importance, and then our UI can just dynamically, we can set our UI maybe to only display the high importance items and hide the medium ones. And this will allow us to adjust our user interface simply by changing the annotation data here. We can also create presentation variants in order to build the sort, which columns we want to sort on, ascending, descending. We also, before we had to code all of that in the view itself. Now we moved it out of the view and we moved it to these annotations, so it's no longer user interface application specific. It's much easier to change and have it affect multiple applications at a time. All right, so we're done adding our annotations, so we can come up here and we'll do the build CDS to get those into our generated objects. And once the build is done, and there it's complete, let's build our database module to pick up those changes. Even though they're just annotations, we want to make sure that everything is up to date. We didn't accidentally change anything else. And then we can rerun our service module. Pick up the changes to our OData V4 service. There we are. That's done. And we've made a lot of other changes to our MTA YAML since the last time we ran our service. Even though they didn't directly impact our OData service, it's going to have to do a full rebuild, so we'll give it just a second there. Here we go, the full redeployment is finished. So let's go check our OData service. Oh, I broke my own rule and tried to test it directly. Got to go through the web module. And let's go to our OData service and specifically the metadata. So it's the same metadata call, but now in OData V4, the metadata has a lot of new, richer syntax that's available, and basically all those annotations that we added, so the communication, the UI, these are all things that even though they're SAP defined, they can be displayed here in the metadata. We don't need a separate service call, a separate place to go to get the additional annotations. But what you'll see if we scroll down, you'll start seeing the additional annotation data, the field labels, the field control types, whether a field is mandatory, whether it's read-only, the relationships here for the value help, like the currency, the connection here, even input and output parameters to do value help, value list on a certain column. That was all built out of the annotations you saw there. All the descriptions of all the entities are here, the read-only, mandatory, text only. So you see all that rich metadata, the importance, it's all here in this metadata document. So it's easy to get access to on the client side and easy to build dynamic handling of your UI elements. And of course, if you're using the Fiori templates, they're already designed to read this metadata and adjust dynamically off of it. It isn't something that you necessarily have to code. But as I said, the Fiori templates are also going through this time where they're converting over to OData V4 as well. So we are in a little bit of sort of a strange transition time. Now, what I've done is I prepared a user interface for us. So let's, so we don't have to type the whole thing from scratch. Let's go get that. List v4.zip. We'll download that. There we are. And let's import that into our web module resources. Okay, it's not wildly different than our OData V2 user interfaces. If we would look at the index HTML, it's got a similar bootstrap. We're using the same startup code. If we look at our component JS, the component is similar. I do have some logic in here for being able to use like stubbed in data, proxy data, but that's largely for testing purposes. We'll come back to this in maybe a minute. But let's look at the manifest. So I'm pointing to my OData V4 service. Not wildly different there. The main difference is in the settings. I do tell it OData version 4. That's obviously different. If we come down here, our model, we're not having to create a, let's see, what do we call this? We actually call this data source default. We do have a model for it, preload true, synchronization mode none. So it's slightly different settings than what we had with OData V2, but same basic concept here. Of creating a data source for, or creating a model for our OData data source. Okay. If we look at our view, so if we look at our main view, this is quite a bit different. What I've done here is I've looked at and studied how the Fiori templates work. They use this special templating elements that allow you to build a generic structure and basically do loops and if statements within your XML definition that will respond to the metadata that you're binding it to. So we can do value helps, we can declare variables in here, helpers for the labels to be dynamic. We can say template with and tell it the annotation, like the line item annotation, and then basically repeat a structure of the template. We can have if checks. Basically, we're checking the enumeration member here of importance, so that if it's low, we don't display it. If it's high, then we bold it. So we're not having to drop back into JavaScript in the controller like we did earlier with our V2 example. We can still declaratively define in a view XML, but this isn't a static view XML like in the earlier examples. It's very dynamic. It's going to adjust automatically to the metadata that's fed to it. Okay. So now we've got our user interface. Let's run this. So I will edit my run configurations to point to my new application. This is PO list, save and run. Now I have some extra coding in here. You saw in my component there was some extra coding. It's largely hidden here. I'm outputting the technical details here, basically of the metadata. I'm parsing it and all the annotations. I'm showing you the raw access to the annotations. It's more for if you want to study the inner workings. Let's focus in on the view XML and the fact that we bound our OData service, our OData V4 service. We're not showing all the columns. Some of the columns are bolded, some are not bolded, and that's all coming from the annotations. And for instance, if we want to change something here, let's say we've got partner ID. Let's go over to our annotation for our partner ID, and let's just comment it out. And if we save this and do a build CDS, and then just change, once that's done, there we are. Just rerun our service, but not make any changes to our UI. All we've done is change our service metadata. And we come over here and we refresh, and we see the partner ID column is gone. So we have an adaptive user interface that can be altered just by changing the annotation metadata. Annotation metadata that isn't even part of the service itself. We've attached it, overridden the annotations that are there, attached additional annotations to an already existing service. So you can see once again how maybe SAP delivers the service or the entity, and you as a customer can come in here and extend the existing entities with your own annotations that then affect even the standard user interfaces. So very powerful technique, a very important technique as we move forward and we start talking about S4 extensions. That's largely what this technology is created for. But of course, your own custom applications that you're building from scratch, you want them to be just as functionally robust and adaptable as the SAP delivered Fiori applications as well. So knowing how to build these applications from scratch, knowing how to utilize these annotations in a proper way is important for even building your own applications.